Well, as we've been hearing, the fight goes on in Mariupol. The former head of the British Army said Ukraine's battle to retain the besieged southern port city will have a very gruesome end. General Richard Dannett said it's only a matter of time before it falls under complete Russian control.
I'm afraid that remaining garrison in Mariupol, they don't really have very many options. According to all reports that one's hearing, they're running very short of ammunition. And I think the Ukrainian forces generally are not able to resupply them. So I think it's only a matter of time before Mariupol completely falls under Russian control. As we heard over the weekend, the Russians did offer some kind of surrender option, which the Ukrainian forces have chosen not to accept. So I'm afraid this is going to be a very gruesome and sad end to an heroic fight by those Ukrainian soldiers. But it's going to end, I think, probably sooner rather than later, with Mariupol completely falling under Russian control. And then, of course, the Russians will have achieved one of their strategic objectives, which is that land corridor from Crimea through Mariupol to the Donbass region.
Richard Dannett, the former head of the British Army. Well, for some analysis, we're joined in the studio by Dr. Marek Lazkiewicz, who is an Eastern European analyst and chairman of POSK, the Polish Social and Cultural Association, and he's been a regular guest here on Arise News. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. What's first of all, your assessment of President Zelensky's threats to end peace talks if the last Ukrainian forces are attacked in Mariupol? Is that just posturing, do you think?
I'm afraid so. It is just posturing. The problem is the Russians are most unlikely to stop finishing their conflict in the Mariupol, and therefore this is simply one more statement. What is very important is the peace talks continue, because the war, as shown by the recent missile strikes, is now turning ever uglier.
So what is your understanding of the current peace talks and where they stand at the moment? I mean, do they seem to be stalling, the fighting side winning over the negotiating side?
They're stalling primarily because Ukraine has, of course, a problem. If it chooses to cede some territory, which on the hand would probably be the best idea, it is against its notion that it wants to keep its territorial integrity. So here's the first problem. Secondary, now it has Western arms, perhaps it feels it can win the conflict in some degree, and so therefore the peace talks, unfortunately, are not progressing as they should. It stated that it is imperative for the peace talks to succeed before the world war turns even uglier or spreads further or indeed escalates.
And whenever you mention World War, I'm always reminded of your book, which is becoming almost prophetic, but also something of a classic. You mentioned equipment, military equipment there. I mean, reports suggesting that Ukrainians are using military equipment that's different from those used in the West, and that is complicating supply problems.
Yes, there will be some supply problems. There are logistic problems in supplying Ukraine in any case. The key problem is, do the Ukrainians have sufficient equipment to stop the Russians? If they do not, as is likely to be the case unless the West really steps up its supplies, therefore Ukraine eventually will lose. If it loses, the war unfortunately will definitely escalate, in my opinion, according to my previous books, and spread to other regions, including the Baltic states and Poland.
I mean, I mentioned the equipment because you're obviously from Poland, and presumably that's why there's the focus, I mean, not because you're from Poland, but there's the focus on the old Soviet equipment from NATO countries that have that sort of equipment going to Ukraine to try to keep things simple for the Ukrainians.
Well, there is that. The other aspect is to what extent the West wants to become involved in supplying equipment. There's the whole business of the West not really engaging in this conflict. As it's known, I have stated before, in my opinion, sanctions are insufficient and various imprecations are also insufficient. The West has to supply more equipment to the Ukrainians or step in, ideally militarily, so that this conflict can be dampened down and stopped before it goes too far.
But what about the supplies that are said to be coming from places like Poland, the Czech Republic, those former Soviet places, is the problem that that equipment is old and nowhere near as good as modern sort of Western military equipment?
There's no question of its obsolescence. That doesn't come into any sort of argument. If it purely was on the basis of obsolete equipment from the former Warsaw Pact countries, then Ukraine wouldn't stand much of a chance. It really hinges on the Western supplies getting through. The Russia has, please note, in the period of peace, that is to say from the Cold War, been developing its army, especially when Putin took power, and therefore it has much better equipment than what was previously available.
Let's turn to reports of explosions across Ukraine, including sort of missile attacks on Lviv, which is just 80 kilometers from the Polish border. And that's a city which up till now has been unscathed. What do you think is behind this latest Russian action?
Oh, the Russian action is designed to show the whole of Ukraine, all the Ukrainians, that they are at war, that they can be struck at whim, and that therefore they should consider seriously surrendering to Russia, which I believe is what the Russians would really like. I don't believe they're merely after the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. And therefore, there is another aspect to this. It also shows that the war is scaling up in this respect, because previously the cities were far away. They're not direct military targets. This is indiscriminate bombing, and therefore, alas, it has to be said, it's a type of terror bombing.
Right, and very briefly, Lviv, as I said, very close to the Polish border. What's been the reaction in Poland to these attacks on Lviv?
Well, they're horrified. The fact of the matter is the Russians are showing that they could be on the Ukrainian-Polish frontier, in principle, at least in terms of missiles. And of course, there is this implication, which I've said, that they could be there militarily too.
And as you look forward about a month from now, you know, assessing the Ukrainians' ability to retaliate against the Russians, what do you see?
I don't think it's a question of Ukrainians retaliating rather than holding out. It's not possible for Ukraine to go further than that. And moreover, if they to retaliate, in your sense of the word, on the Russians themselves across the border, that would bring forth a far stronger Russian reply. Rather, it's whether the Ukrainians can hold out or not, which indeed we hope they can.
Dr. Marek Lazkiewicz, Eastern Europe analyst and chairman of POSK, the Polish Social and Cultural Association. Always appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for inviting me.